Welcome. I'm Susie Peacock from QAA Scotland. I'm in conversation with Simon Thomson today. Simon, first, can I thank you very much indeed for attending our very first event for the Tertiary Enhancement Project in Glasgow on the 20th of September. And Simon, I was wondering if you can tell us something about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So I'm currently work at the University of Manchester. I'm a professor of hybrid learning, but my role at the moment is director of flexible learning.
Oh, that's great. Great. Now, I'm assuming that that role means that you are investigating modalities. And we spend a lot of time in the project getting very excited about this term. But I was wondering, what does it mean to you?
Yes, so as you know, Susie, I'm very keen on understanding much more about modalities. So I often refer to us as being kind of living and teaching in kind of a mixed modal environment. We're very often thinking about the modes through which we're having meetings. So, for example, we're doing this remotely. So that is an synchronous mode that we're in at the moment. And so, yeah, we have to think more deeply about modes and modality. And I'm doing a lot of work trying to understand, I suppose, the value of the modalities through which we teach and through which we work.
Now, values is something that I see very much in your work. And I was wondering, why are you so enthusiastic about values? What is it that you think is why do we need to spend time on the values? Why do we need to identify these values?
Well, I think for me, it's because when we're designing, let's say, curriculum, if we don't design with the modality in mind, then we won't be able to maximize the potential of that modality. But in order for us to be able to design with that modality in mind, we've got to understand the value of it. So the way that I talk about value is across a number of kind of categories, and these are fluid at the moment. I haven't kind of settled on them, but when we think about the modes through which we teach, there's some values that can be prescribed to them and categorized in a number of ways. So one of those categories is the value that it has on a learning and teaching level. What value does it bring to learning and teaching?
Yeah, another one. Just wondering if you could just give me a little bit more about values for learning and teaching.
Yeah, no, of course. So if we think about an in-person synchronous on-campus session, the learning experience there is very different to one which is online asynchronous. And we have to articulate what the value of that is, because we need students to come onto campus for certain things. Now, one of the values, for example, in a learning and teaching context is if I design a session which is really discursive and you want students to participate really meaningfully in that discussion, then actually an in-person on-campus experience probably gives us the richest value that we could have in the context of that designed experience. That's not to say that you can't have discursive activities in online synchronous spaces. We'll all be familiar with a breakout room phenomena, but actually yes. the fluidity of the conversation and the way in which we interact with each other is a much richer level of discussion and a learning experience in person on campus. So we have to articulate that value. We've got to say to students, oh, we're running this session in person on campus because we're running it as a discursive session, and the learning experience will be much richer in that context.
You think we haven't been very good at actually doing that? We're just assuming that our learners, perhaps because of the pandemic, we're just assuming all our learners are going to come back on campus and will automatically know, of course you come in face to face, of course it's going to be a rich learning environment. Do you think we've got a little bit, well, they should know this?
Well, I think we make a lot of assumptions, and then we're a bit blasé about it, aren't we? We assume that they are going to attribute loads of value to being on campus in a face-to-face environment. But I think what we've learned, and we would have all seen headlines of empty classrooms and empty lecture theatres, is that what students soon realise is actually there's not a huge amount of value that we might have assumed they would think. So that is articulated by them not turning up. Now, we could argue that, well, it's in their best interest if they do turn up and sit in a lecture theatre and listen to me talk to them. But the reality is that if they're still passing their modules and are still achieving good grades, then there clearly is a misalignment of values there, isn't there? We may have prescribed a huge amount of value to it ourselves. We may think it's really important that students come to the lecture theatre and they come and listen to my lectures, but the students themselves will vote with their feet. And I think what we have to start doing is saying, right, there is value in those experiences, but we've got to articulate to students what the value is, and we've got to design for the modality to maximize the value.
Now that's what I wanted to tease out, because sometimes it may be appropriate for us not to have synchronous face-to-face when we're not being so discursive, when we're not asking our learners to perhaps work in groups and look at case studies. We may just feel, okay, we're going to do a lecture, and if you decide that you don't want to come, you can watch the lecture online.
Yeah, so again, there's a whole set of types of learning, isn't there? So there's types of learning that we design, and we have to design that type in the context of the mode as well. And you'll know that I refer to this as conscious modality. So this idea of us consciously thinking about the mode, as well as the type of activity that we want to work with. So let's take a synchronous lecture, because that's a really good example. Most people are, they understand what it is, and they've largely, most of this audience will have experienced it. But there is still value in person, on campus synchronous lectures. So for example, if you take something like TED Talks as an example of that, that's a really valuable experience of being in the place at the time in a synchronous audience-based environment. And so the idea there is that maybe we still do want synchronous in-person on-campus lectures, and I think we very much do, but we probably don't need them all the time. So we might want them at the very beginning of a program, because if you,
I think you're exactly right, because it's at that beginning of a program when you can start building those relationships with your learners. You can infuse them with, obviously, your passion with the subject area. And then that's an absolute conscious reason that I've got for getting my students in.
That's right.
But then I might be saying, right, we'll go and watch a few lectures that I've done, and you don't need to come in for that, but come back in a little later.
Yeah, and also I think what we have to remember is actually a lot of students like the initial novelty of the lecture. It's kind of the essence of an on-campus university, isn't it? If you talk to young people that are about to go to university, one of the things they talk about is being in a lecture theatre and speaking, and that initially is great. So why would we want to say no to that when actually that is part of an on-campus experience? But then that the novelty wears off, doesn't it? And they lose the value. So I think it's absolutely about designing for the mode at a certain time in that journey. And I think at the beginning is where that novelty is like, oh, this is great. I'm sat in a lecture theatre with all of these other people that are learning the topic that I'm learning. And I can sit next to new people, I can get to know people. And also there at the front is my lecturer, my professor, who's going to talk to me about their subject. That's really exciting. But then at some point, that lecture becomes a bit tiresome. And if it's at 9 o'clock in the morning, then I've got to hold a lot of value with that for make me getting out of bed. So at that point, we might think, well, actually, this is where we switch the mode, because other modes have different values, particularly around accessibility. For example, we might be able to increase access to our lectures by
Yes.
switching some of them out to be synchronous online. And another example is if you use it like a guest lecture program and you want to bring in voices from across the globe, it's unrealistic to do that in person on campus. So sometimes that things like operational and administrative value is in that design, because if I wanted to bring a voice from the global south, for example, and say, how do I bring that voice into my classroom? Realistically, the best way I'm going to be able to achieve that is through an online synchronous kind of activity, not an on-campus one.
And it's exactly, and so we've got the value of that. We can see what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve. Our learners can see that. And also, it's nice to have that variety. I want people to hear different voices. I don't want them to just hear my voice. As wonderful as my voice is, I like them to hear other perspectives and other key thinkers in that area. And I think that's what the technology can offer us so much. Why, there's a lot to think about here, because in your work, you talk about obviously the value of modalities for accessibility, you talk about for operations and administration, but you also talk about social and well-being. And I was just wondering if I could ask you to speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, again, this is where one of the categories of the values of modality is around that social and well-being kind of factor. And I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, when there was a big realization that students sat in their own rooms on their own actually is not great for anyone's kind of well-being. So there may be times where we're designing experiences that aren't focused entirely around the learning. They might have a learning component, but we design them for the social interaction and the well-being component as the priority. And this is where the value bit comes in, because you don't always design for equal value across all of the categories. Sometimes you might design a learning experience with a particular mode in mind, because you know the emphasis is around the social and well-being component. And then, so you might design a very playful session in that modal sense, because what you really want students to do is interact with each other, feel a sense of belonging to the program. And although they will learn things, the focus there is around them getting to know each other, for example, and getting to know their subject and their topic in a kind of playful manner. So this is why we need to consciously factor the mode into that, because again, it's more likely that that is going to realize the benefits of that in an in-person session more readily, although you may have done some pre-preparation activity as online asynchronous, and this is where you begin to join those modes together. So quite often in my own life, I often meet people first in a place like Twitter, get to know them and have conversations with them, but then when I arrive at a conference, we've already had an introduction. So it's nice to be able to then pick up on a conversation that we've had elsewhere. So designing the integration of mode is really important as well. So you might kick something off synchronously online and then have something on campus that follows up on it.
I think we've not emphasized that enough, is how do we look at it as a whole?
Yeah.
Often when I'm talking to academics, it will be, well, I'm going to do this bit synchronous, I'm going to do this bit asynchronous, and then I'm doing this bit, etc. And we're not thinking about the flow of the module or the learning event. And I'm thinking particularly when there are some really key topics that are quite difficult for our learners, I like to have them in and to maybe watch a lecture beforehand, a recording, but then come in and actually do something and make it a little bit playful, because I know this may be something that they're probably going to struggle a little bit with, but when they're with other people and we're actually engaging with it, it takes some of that fear away from it.
Yeah,
but
it does. I think
just before, because I think you and I could probably talk for a long time.
we could.
Can I just ask you, where are you going now? We've got our 4 areas so far. What next?
Well, for me, so in the work that we're doing at the University of Manchester around flexible learning, modality has to play a part in those conversations around how do we flex between modes and how do we design between modes. So a lot of my work at the moment is thinking a bit strategically about that, because it affects all sorts of things like timetabling. You know, how do we timetable across a kind of mixed modal environment?
Yeah,
because it becomes a lot more complex, because timetabling for on campus has nearly always been focused on the rooms that we have and the spaces that we teach in.
yeah, and I think we're starting to see that come through our work, and it's how do we get the physical estate, which is fit for purpose for this new way of working. When we're deploying conscious modality, we need to have flexibility when it comes to the different really different areas and spaces that we have available for our learners.
We do, and I think we've got to learn to design spaces that are flexible themselves, because, you know, if we want to move away from everybody having a lecture every week for 12 to 15 weeks,
yeah,
we've got to reimagine what lecture theatres are like. And we've got some of those at Manchester. We've got these blended lecture theatres that can also be used as discursive, collaborative spaces as well. So I think we're starting that conversation, but we've also got legacy spaces that we've also got to integrate into that design. And in some cases, and I think one of the categories is administrative and operational. Sometimes that administrative and operational component will absolutely influence what spaces we have available. And we have to kind of sometimes work within that, but that doesn't preclude us or exclude us from not using other spaces as well. But we have to consciously design for it. You mentioned there this idea of the flipped classroom, really, is what you talked about. And my experience of that is most times that fails is where we don't articulate to students why we've designed the flipped classroom in that way and the benefits of it. We just make an assumption that they're going to do the work, the precursor work, and then turn up for the conversation. And then they don't do the precursor work, and then they turn up and we can't really have a conversation. And again, this is us about articulating the value and articulating the design decision that we've made, because we often keep that bit hidden just from students. And often I've learned to say, no, I've designed it this way because when you come onto campus, I want it to be really valuable, really purposeful, and really move you on in your learning. And if you don't do that little bit before that, you won't be able to move as far as others will.
And I think it's treating our learners like adults. They are adults. They've made a decision. They've come to study in whichever program we are offering. So let's be honest and say, we want to get the best out of you. We want to get the best learning outcomes for you. This is why we're doing it. And this is how we're doing it. And this is how you're going to need to engage with this so that you get the best out of it. I just want to go on to just one final comment, and I try to restrain myself. And I think when we're talking about physical estates, we often don't articulate to our colleagues in estates what we're trying to do. And I know I've been trying to sometimes adapt our campuses, and we all have legacy areas. And I feel, you know, estates colleagues are there to help us, but they are, like all of us, restrained by resources. But we are conscious in our modality of what we're trying to do. We're bringing the estates team on as much as our learners and as much as our colleagues who are teaching in our programs with us.
That's right. And the more we learn about modality, the more informed we can have conversations with estates. I think there's often sometimes a tension between the physical estate plan and the information that estates are being fed. And it's not always entirely an estates team's fault that they end up with a result that isn't what people want, because often we're not very good at articulating what we want. And sometimes you end up falling back almost on a traditionalist model because it's the thing that we can hold on to, and we know we know what that's like. I think we do have to be much more visionary with our spaces and design them with a flexible first kind of mentality. So We're not
Absolutely.
designing just for one activity. We're now designing for different types of activities. And we're seeing that more and more, I think. I think the problem we end up with is we still end up with lecture theatres that are lecture theatres, but then we always seem to end up with seminar rooms that are also laid out like mini lecture theatres, like
Oh, yes.
stereographic chairs. So
Yes.
just getting over that for a
Yes.
starting point. But you're
Yes.
absolutely right. The more we understand about the value of the mode, the more we can then influence the design of our physical estate and our digital estate as well, because they have to start to work much more harmoniously together and not be seen as separate entities. So one of the things that we're doing as part of the flexible learning program is we're going to build a hyflex teaching space. So hyflex is where, so this is where some people call it hybrid, but hyflex is this idea that if you want to turn up on campus for the session, you can, but
Yep.
you'll equally have an experience by coming and joining remotely. But you've really got to design a space for that. And that's what
Absolutely.
we're going to do. We're going to try that out, because I'm not entirely convinced that you can give an equal experience to on-campus and online students at the same time, but I'd like to be proven wrong. So we're going to try and design a hyflex space.
Well, we have a few examples here in Scotland, because for obvious reasons, you have to have hybrid or hyflex. Because if you can imagine, we have some students who will be maybe on a Perth campus in UHI, but other students will be up in Aberdeen. And if you've ever tried to drive down the A9 in snow, you will know you're going to advocate hybrid.
I think there's lots of examples where remote students can effectively join a session, but I don't think they can fully participate the same way. So how can we design a space where the participation and the value experience is equal? Like I say, I'm not convinced we can, but we're going to try something so that we can see the extent to which it's possible, or the extent to which we always recognize that the remote component is always going to be a slightly less valuable experience than being there. But actually the remote component increases access. So again, that's the value bit, isn't it? How do you balance the value between each of those modes?
Yeah, I remember we had some learners in the Falkland Islands, and there was no way they were ever going to be able to join us. So we had a few hybridish types of events. And I always felt for these lovely students in the Falklands, so we could see the penguins. But getting them to be able to work in groups, getting the technology was always so difficult. And as soon as a lecturer, when you started to try and have anything, you were trying to make sure they were engaged as much as you're face-to-face. I really wish you well on that. I'm so looking forward to it. Now, I know I have got to stop this conversation, which is very difficult for me, but thank you. I am so looking forward to meeting you on the 20th. And thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you ever so much.
Okay.